make the case that the New Testament is reliable historical documents that make up the New Testament, then I would argue from that point that Jesus did in fact rise from the dead, the historical evidence for his resurrection from the dead. And by the way, you can get one of the world's leading atheists, Anthony Flew, debated my former apologetics professor at Liberty University, Dr. Gary Habermas, and did not do really well because the New Testament scholars, the amount of what they accept from the New Testament as historically proven is enough to make a very strong case for the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. And Anthony Flew was kind of out of his league in that particular debate, did not do real well in that debate, and he was trying to argue against the resurrection of Christ. But I think once you provide the historical evidence for the resurrection of Christ from the dead, then his claims to deity begin to make sense, and then we could see, man's greatest enemy, death, defeated, conquered through the resurrection of the Lord Jesus. But then you find Christ's views about the Scriptures, and Christ viewed the Old Testament Scriptures as the inerrant Word of God, and promised that through the apostles, his words, heaven and earth would pass away, but his words would be preserved. His words would not pass away, and so it appears to be a promise that the New Testament would hold the same status as the Old Testament. And so basically then you would have the doctrines taught in the Scriptures according to Jesus would be divinely inspired truth. So there's a long, drawn-out, meticulous process of historical evidences for the Christian faith. Now when you go to the Islamic faith, Jesus never claimed to be God, but the Islamic faith, the Book of Quran, that type of thing, I don't think it's really too difficult to point out the inconsistencies in the Quran, or the fact that Muhammad probably never read the New Testament himself. He picked it up from stories and fables through word of mouth from traders in his part of the world, and made a lot of big blunders where he had Moses' sister he confused with the mother of Jesus, and there's a gap of 1,500 years. He had no knowledge of the chronology of the Bible. He had the Tower of Babel existing simultaneously with Moses. So, but I think you can make a case that the historical doctrines of Christianity, the deity of Christ, the resurrection of Christ from the dead, salvation only through Him, the miraculous life of Christ, these things that are denied in the Islamic by the Islamic faith and Judaism, I think you can make a strong historical case that the evidence speaks loudly in favor of Christianity. But again, we're talking about something that entire books, entire college-level courses are taught on, and then that's the difficulty with pluralism, is that it starts so far away from historic Christianity that there is so much work that needs to be done. Fortunately, human beings are such that sometimes it only takes one spark to ignite an entire fire to cause a person to change a worldview. In other words, sometimes the person's got one objection, and if you can answer that objection, everything else falls into place. But we are starting so far away. There's a different view of what is the ultimate reality. There's a different view of history. There's a different view of who man is. There's a different view of salvation, and so there's just an awful lot of work. I mean, we're in what Western civilization is in what the late Francis Schaeffer referred to as a post-Christian era, and what that basically amounts to is the more we move forward in time, the further we get away from Christianity, the harder it is just to communicate the gospel, let alone defend the gospel. And Many pluralists are very skeptical about his history as a science to begin with. So historical evidence may be meaningless to them. So you may have to actually spend years of laying the groundwork with these particular people in more philosophical areas and try to persuade them to accept a different concept of truth before you even get into the dialogue on historical issues. Sure.
I was just curious, how do you talk to people about moral doubts? Like, how do you accept that people with seemingly good morals are going to hell because they don't believe in Christ? Moral doubts like that.
Yeah, and those are always good questions, and it's, I usually tell people when they say, well, are you telling me that because I don't believe in Jesus, even though I do lots of nice things for people, are you telling me a nice guy like me is going to go to hell? I basically tell them, look, if I was God, I'd let you in heaven right now because you're okay in my book. But the fact of the matter is, what that is one imperfect man telling another imperfect man that I can tolerate your imperfections because of my own imperfections. But the Bible teaches that there is a totally holy, totally just God who can have no fellowship whatsoever with sin. He is so just that he must judge and punish all sin before it can be forgiven. And so basically that's the gospel of love, is the fact that God sent his own Son, who did not deserve death, who did not deserve punishment, to suffer and die on our cross as a substitute sacrifice to take our punishment for us, to satisfy the justice of God, so that now that our sins have been paid for in full by the Lord Jesus. See, justice demands that the punishment fits the crime. Well, our crime is we rebelled against the ultimately worthy being. Therefore, we deserve the ultimate punishment. The Bible refers to that as eternal separation from God, or the eternal flames of hell. And there's a debate about whether these flames are literal flames or is just the turmoil of spending eternity separated from God. But in order for there to be a substitute sacrifice, that sacrifice must be an ultimately worthy sacrifice. Hence, God, the second person of the Trinity, became a man and took our punishment for us, and that satisfies the justice of God. So nobody, the good news is, the bad news is we're all sinners, we all deserve the flames of hell. The good news is that nobody has to go to hell now, because Jesus has paid the price. However, God is a God of love. He's not going to force people against their will to spend eternity with him. So basically what it gets down to is, I would openly admit to a person, if a person's a nice person, I admit, you're okay in my book. But my book doesn't amount to a hill of beans. We're talking about the all-holy, the almighty God, the totally just God who cannot have sin come before him. And we because we are sinners, we take sin too lightly, and we forget that sin basically is rebellion against the ultimately worthy being. And so sin is a lot uglier than we often view it ourselves. But basically, Galatians 2:21, Paul says, I do not nullify the grace of God, for if righteousness comes through the law, then Christ died needlessly. So everybody who's saying, I can save myself by my works, I can get into heaven on my own, is basically saying that Jesus was a fool who wasted his time dying on the cross because he didn't need to do it. I could save myself. So,
okay, really quickly then, I mean, within a pluralist context, then how does the Christian define sin or evil that is so different from, say, the Muslim or the Hindu or the Buddhist, that really makes sin this reality that we all experience?
Yeah.
I mean, because maybe the Christian's perspective of sin is true for the Christian, but what about, say, the Muslim or even the Hindu who doesn't really believe in evil?
Yeah, and there, and you're hitting the nail on the head, because it's in Western civilization was so influenced by the Christian worldview that even if a person wasn't a Christian, they held to the Christian view of truth, the Christian view of morality, and so basically you just gave them the gospel message and then they would accept it or reject it, but they understood it at least. But now Western culture, because of what Francis Schaeffer means by a post-Christian era, that's not the case. Now you can often dialogue with a person for an hour and a half and think that communication is taking place, when if the other person has a different concept of truth than you have and a different concept of moral values than you have, you might be saying the same things, but actually meaning totally, different things by those. So basically, what I do is when I share the gospel message, I keep it as simple as possible, and I allow the person to raise objections, and then I try to answer those objections. And but sometimes, I have spent hours and days dialoguing with a person before I really start understanding where they're coming from, because their worldview is so far from ours. And that is, for Christians, this is a very tough time to live, because, it used to be you just used to share the faith with people. Now you got to not only share it but defend the faith. But now the problem goes even beyond that. Sometimes it appears almost impossible to just communicate to other people in the Christian concepts.
That because this pluralist view of the nature of truth and the nature of reality has influenced our way of thinking about truth. And it's hard to communicate with others when we talk about things like truth. With the Christian worldview, and Western civilization was saturated by it, man felt that, hey, God has revealed Himself to us. We can be very confident that we know what Francis Schaeffer calls true truth. We know absolute truth. But what happened was we got overconfident in our ability to reason, to use our reason to find truth, that eventually guys like René Descartes came upon the scene. Even though he professed Christianity, we began to think that we could prove everything through reason alone. And so a guy like Blaise Pascal responded to Descartes, well, if we could prove everything by reason alone, what need do we have for revelation from God? He saw where it was leading. But anyway, through the Enlightenment and modernism, man thought that he could prove everything through human reason alone. He thought his reason was infallible. And what we found out was not that there's some things you can't prove through reason alone. We actually found out that there's really, when everything's said and done, I think you can go so far to say there's nothing that you can prove, nothing at least that leaves the realm of ideas. There's nothing that you can prove through reason alone once you leave the realm of just ideas, things that are true by definition and that type of thing. And so the confidence in human reason took a nosedive. And now we've entered into something called postmodernism. Now, we talk about the difficulty defining pluralism. You can come up with 1,000 different definitions of postmodernism. You read a book, you think you know what postmodernism is, so you buy a book that refutes it, and after you read it, you find out that you know less about postmodernism now after reading the book than you thought you knew before you went into it, because it's just, postmodern is just a big title given to a whole bunch of different views, different ideas that have this at least in common. We've rejected
mankind in general has rejected modernism's faith in human reason to find truth, and so now the whole concept of truth is in question, as to whether or not there is absolute truth. And so we have the subjective idea that what's true for me is true for me. It doesn't have to be true for you, and vice versa. We have the views of the existentialism that it's not important whether what you believe is objectively true. All that's important is that you passionately believe it. My reality may be totally different from your reality, and that type of thing. So it's to the point where not only is it difficult to convince people, to persuade people to become Christians, it's becoming difficult to just communicate what the gospel is saying.
Well, it seems, being a philosophy major, that's becoming a difficulty just in discussion in general. Like I've found just in philosophy classes, a lot of students don't speak up. And this has nothing to do with any talk on God's existence, or any, just with the nature of truth, the nature of reality, or any kind of moral talk. It's become difficult to discuss these issues with people, just because communication has become so difficult. Terms are so confusing now. People have sort of chucked this whole idea of defining your terms and sort of gone with, well, if I experience truth this way, then it's good for me not to do that.
There's a professor at Olympic College, Rob.
Oh, I was just curious, like there's a common argument that, like, how do we know we're all not like brains in a vat? Or like, if you're like a Star Trek fan, it's like, how do we know we're not on a holodeck or something? Like, I mean, how does Christianity respond to that sort of like argument for pluralism, or that pluralism might exist or be true?
Well, just the whole idea that truth is relative. If truth is relative and there is no absolute truth, that statement itself would be an absolute truth. And another
well, I know it's a self-refuting statement, but I don't think that it's necessarily valid to say that we can confine reality or all of the universe or the experience to human syntax and say, well, because this doesn't work in our sort of Western linguistic grammatical structure, then therefore it does not exist.
I think it goes beyond
logic. Doesn't.
I think it goes beyond those syntax. I think it's the equipment of the mind, the way we think. We even think in terms of antithesis.
Well, just because we believe in or we have common structures of polar opposites, if it's not true, then it's false. I mean, isn't that sort of limiting and confining to think that because it doesn't fit into this sort of binary, like ones and zeros structures, that therefore it has to be like either true or false?
Well, all I'm saying, you may not like, and I don't even know if you are holding the other position or not, but I'll just assume that you do hold that position. You may not like my position, but at least I can verbalize it. Consistent. I can verbalize my position consistent with my position. I can think about my position consistent with my position, and I don't think that's the case with those who deny absolute truth.
Are you asking just? It seems that we can talk about logic and that kind of analytical thinking, and that's great to have this formal background, right? But in terms of just everyday existence and trying to deal with discovering the nature of the universe in whatever way, that things seem to be a little more gray and not so black and white.
Well, I was trying to figure out his idea of that there are no absolutes as a self-refuting statement, and I was talking about that, and then I was talking about the brain in a vat question, like how do I know that any of this is real, or that I'm just not being sort of fed on protein substance, and that all of my sensory input is just sort of plugged into me. So how do I know, or how do I have any sort of cable or access to true reality, or is there any evidence for that?
Yeah, I'm not arguing, by the way, for logical necessity I'm not trying to find conclusions that are rationally, with rational certainty. But at the same time, I believe a worldview that is not livable, and Francis Schaeffer used arguments along these lines as well. I believe any worldview that's not livable is really not it's not a viable option. I mean, it's not worth holding to. And the fact of the matter is, you're here, so I know you're eating food. You showed up, wearing clothes.
Well, you're trusting, or you're believing that I'm here and real and physical.
Well, if you want to tell me you're not here, that's fine with me. But as far as I'm concerned, I think there are certain things, like J.P. Moreland says, there are certain things that we know, but we may have a difficulty proving it.
Well, I mean,
but the fact of the matter is, you eat food just like I eat food, even though I accept the existence of food, you may question it.
But like people thought like the world was flat, and they knew that the world was flat, and that the world was the center of the solar system and not the sun, like before, like Copernicus and stuff. So, and they knew that, but they were wrong, at least by our standards now. So, like,
are you saying
that's what I'm wondering.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. This is kind of an epistemological question. It's the same question that Descartes dealt with, right? With his doubting.
He wanted to find
dream.
Yeah, because I mean, I think that's really what it comes down to is pluralism. Pluralism says that there is no access to truth, or to one single truth. Mm-hmm. And so, since there is no single truth that we can apprehend, then relativism is our only option.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that is what
I would agree with that. But pluralism says that if the truth exists out there, I have no way to get to it.
Yeah.
I can't prove that I exist. I can't really prove beyond the shadow of a doubt anything. Mm-hmm. So you can always go back and question my evidence, you can question my method, you can question anything.
Right.
We can argue forever. So at that point, you've got to ask the question, if there is a God, then it seems to be the only way I could know is if he broke through the mess and spoke in such a way that I could understand. Because from my perspective, I've got a 3-pound brain that's not going to unravel the entire code. But if there's some transcendence that sits above the system, then they can access my reality and give me access to truth. And so that necessitates the need for faith and for relation, for something to go through the system.
Yeah, and
well, and I don't know, for a pluralist, how would they escape, back to that when we were just like talking about the logic believing in exclusivism. If your logic was that, if pluralism is true, then no matter what, you're safe. But in Christianity, it's God is the only way to go. So why not with exclusivism? But I guess for me it seems like, okay, well, since I fear death, I'm going to believe in exclusivism is just the way to go. But are you being honest with yourself? I mean, you can't have you convince yourself that you believe.
Well, yes.
You would say something, just saying, like fire insurance. Well, I don't really believe there's going to be a fire, but just in case the house burns down, fire insurance. Well, I don't really believe in God, but just in case there is, I'm going to believe that just for a second. We would say that, that's not very, honest, it's not very real, it's not very relevant. So, I don't believe in marriage, but just in case I should have a wife, it's not really the reason for the relationship, it's just exclusively out of fear. And so, with that thing, let's say you want to do with the exclusivist position should be is to start to look at the evidence and come to a conclusion, not just force us to make a conclusion, but to give us sort of an incentive to
See, that's what Pascal's wager. A lot of people think he's giving an argument for God's existence. He's really not. What he's basically doing is giving an argument that man should seek God, because he's got everything to gain if he finds God, if God does exist and he finds God, and he's got nothing to lose by the search anyway. And whereas on the other side, if he lives as if God doesn't exist, he's not going to gain anything, and he's not going to lose anything if he's right. So but basically, Pascal is just saying that because there's so much to lose that could possibly be lost, and so much that could possibly be gained. But basically, it's the same thing here. There's if pluralism, if it's either all faiths lead to God or exclusivism, I think there's incentive to look at exclusivism, just because there's so much to lose by it. But at the same time, I'm not saying that means that that person who decided, okay, I'm going to look into the claims of Christ, and I'm going to look at it with an open mind. I'm not saying that person is saved, but I'm saying I think that person is being a lot wiser, that just in case Christianity is true, let me look into it. Let me look into the exclusivistic faiths. So I would say it doesn't make the person a believer, but it's a good start. Because I think if a person is open and objectively looks at the evidence, I think the person's going to find the strength of the Christian worldview.
I was thinking too. Seems to me it might be easier if you made an exclusive claim. It would probably be or was false. You'd probably you could make your false conclusion a lot more stronger. And if you made a pluralistic claim, it's hard to. It seems like one can go around that so many different ways, but you couldn't be quite as conclusive about.
It almost.
I'm losing my thoughts here.
I think I know what you're getting at. It kind of lends itself to soft thinking in a sense, in that even if pluralism is correct, it's almost like, well, let's just believe anything. And then because of that, then let's also just believe in nothing. Almost. And so it's almost like, are you saying that's almost what you wind up doing? Do you just kind of go around in circles?
It happens by default, where to be exclusive, the proof, as much as we can know proof, has to be really substantial and conclusive. And so there's that much more reason, one, to be motivated to check it out, because you possibly could come to the same. And two, you would, if you decided that it was true, then you have that much more intellectual reasons to hold to the notion, because it does basically come back to what you were saying. There's going to be fake.
Let me add something to that. I do believe, and this is why I'm not pure rationalist like Descartes. I do believe that, just like Mark said, that there's got to be some presupposition, something that you presuppose as your first principle, or several first principles of thought, and then you start to deduce or draw conclusions from those. And but you can't prove the first principles, because if you could, they wouldn't be first principles. They're not conclusions. They're starting points. But I do believe that the Christian presuppositions, I would agree with the Schaeffer type apologetic, that the Christian presuppositions are open to testing. In other words, the Christian has certain presuppositions, the Buddhist has certain presuppositions, the Muslim has certain presuppositions. I think when we put our presuppositions to the test, I think the Christian presuppositions come out on top. And just the idea we mentioned that, people may deny the existence of the material universe, but they still live like the Christian view of the universe is true. They still eat food and go through the motions, and that was one of the strengths of Schaeffer's argumentation, that the Christian presuppositions are livable. The Christian worldview is livable, whereas the non-Christians, would often argue against the Christian view of this element of reality or this aspect of reality, but then they'll turn around and live as if they're living in the Christian world after all.
I remember a couple of years back I was reading Hume, and he was denying that you cannot prove or disprove anything, and I was like, what am I supposed to do with this? You couldn't live it, and you could not live it.
Yeah.
But then I thought, it's not his point. It's not the point that I'm like, what am I supposed to do now if I can't ever trust or not trust anything that I do, that I'm here, that I'm not here, that I'm thinking. But it was more a fact that I thought of it more that he didn't give you any information about what you could know, but he could tell you that the word absolute truth cannot be used. Right?
In what way? You talking about Hume?
If you could never prove or disprove anything logically, there couldn't be such a thing called an absolute truth.
Yeah.
What you raise is the issue really comes down to, just because something can't be proven does that mean it's not true. I'll give you an example. Again, the hard sciences will go, sure, I can prove gravity, I can solve something. When you get into morals,
probability.
When you get into probability, it's only one. Everybody that's ever grasped something, I'll pick it up.
But it can still be wrong.
Yeah, so it's a possibility.
Then you take it over in the religious or in the moral categories. For example, I say, I love my wife. At that point, I can agree with you and I can say, well, I can't prove or disprove that. So I'm going to maintain agnosticism. And really, I think that's really what's happening on campus, and it's really what's happening in generations. When's the last time I listened to a good picket, a good protest, a good sit-in, anybody really passionate about anything except for the financial income? Then what has happened is that you can't know anything, you can't prove or disprove anything, so you just maintain indifference and ambivalence about everything. And the problem there is you won't make a wrong mistake, but you'll also never really accomplish it.
But that philosophy wasn't to be lived. I mean, I don't think David Hume could have gone walking around like, gosh, I can never know that I'm actually here, or if there's such a thing called an I. I mean, you can't live that wasn't his point.
But Hume was a defender of probability, though. I mean, he's slamming logical, knowing things with rational certainty. At the same time, he argued against miracles because he thought that probability was against it. So Hume was willing to live in a universe with only probable knowledge. To be totally honest with you, on that particular point, I'm not so sure that my views are that far away from Hume, and that's why Mark was saying that eventually you've got to accept something by faith. But what I'm saying is that the Christian presuppositions, the things that we assume by faith, are perfectly consistent with the universe in which we live. I don't find that true from other worldviews. Now, the closer the worldview gets to Christianity, the more livable it appears to be in to live consistently with it. But the further it gets away from Christianity, you have people denying the existence of the material universe while they're sitting down eating a Whopper from Burger King. So.
Well, wasn't the denial of the material universe, wasn't that kind of... No, I was reading a guy, he was actually denying the possibility of the material universe in defense of why there's spiritual substance. If there can be nothing.
He was denying it in the book, right?
Yeah, in a material book.
No, but
And he wanted some material money, too.
No, he wasn't denying that he could experience the book, and that he called this the book, that he could write on it like a book. He just said it was actually
Well, I think it was Ravi Zacharias said that. He said that you got all these intellectuals denying the existence of truth, and he says then they write huge volumes, and they really think you should buy their books, even though their books contain absolutely no truth, if they're correct. And
even Ravi in one of his lectures had a guy stand up and said, well, look, after all you've said, you can't even really prove that I exist, right? Kind of like you're asking. So Ravi's question to him was, well, to whom may I inquire is asking?
but like she was saying, like, nothing has to be true or nothing has to exist for us to admit that we experience that we have the experience of it. So that I may experience touching this book even though it might not exist. So we can talk about the experiences and say, well, yes, we think or perceive that the experiences exist even though that they may not actually exist.
Yeah, I mean, that's always possible, logically possible, right? But when we're talking about just down-to-earth, nitty-gritty kind of existence, which we all deal with every day, it seems to be more and more difficult to keep that theory separate from action. You know what I'm saying?
Well, right. We have to decide somewhere along the line if we're going to live and act as human beings. Like, well, I'm going to assume that that's a door and that it's solid, and then if I don't open my hand, I'm going to run into it.
Right. In fact, and that's why the Christian puts so much emphasis on the fact that truth is not just this ethereal concept that exists out there in the substratum, like Plato's theory of the ideas, right? The Christian conception of truth is that truth became flesh, and it became a person named Jesus Christ, right? He said, I am the way, and the truth, and the life. And so the Christian doesn't just say that we come to know truth through the intellect. It's also a very personal, very experiential element involved in our coming into that knowledge.
Non-rational.
Well, it's rational. It's all of it. It's not
less than rational, but it's more than rational.
There's always faith. Where faith is just a movement of the will to even start to believe in one direction or another.
I have a question for Mark. Go back to what you're saying. I don't understand why you can't be pluralistic or whatever and still believe in Christianity. Like, why can't the two coexist together?
That's a great question. It's a great raging debate on a radio show. Christianity, by definition, is exclusive because the things that, again, Christianity means that I believe in Jesus, and the things that He said are exclusive. And so, at that point, I can't believe all the exclusive things that He said, and believe that it's all right. Because it contradicts it. That's like saying, I love my wife and I beat her. So, here's the love of our lives, don't do that. But you can't hold both of those positions at the same time because they're in contradiction. You can't say, Jesus said, He's the only way, He is God, He is the only one true God, and I only will be saved for Him. And, in addition, God doesn't exist. There's 50 million gods, polytheism. Maybe there isn't a God or agnosticism. I can't hold all those things to be contradiction. Defies the law of non-contradiction and logic. The two things that are usually opposed and exclusive can't both be true. I can't be dead in my life. I can't be on earth and on free at the same time. If there's one from another, one is wrong, or they're both wrong, but they can't both be right. So I would say Christianity is exclusive. And therefore, by the things that Jesus said, if I'm going to believe that He said, I'm exclusive. I say the same thing for a Muslim, for a Jew, for any modern theist. We're not just talking Christianity. Anybody that holds to any sort of system can't hold to all systems.
Yeah, I just say that it's good for me, but it doesn't have to be good for, say, you. It just seems like the traditional view of Christianity is to say, like, when we're Christian, him on the bandwagon, we're all going to go to heaven together. And like we will push towards including other people.
Okay, but then Jesus tells me, again, in the Christian theory, where it comes from is that Jesus tells me that it's true whether or not you believe it, and when you die you fall out. But it seems like maybe I can live as a pluralist in this world, but outside the focus world, I can go all absolutes. That kind of reality is more than its full sense.
I think too, if a pluralist was consistent with his pluralism, he wouldn't have any problems with exclusivism.
Yeah, exactly.
In fact, I could see an exclusivist being an exclusivist is consistent when he debates and argues for his views. A pluralist isn't. A guy who denies truth writing a book about it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me either. So, but I don't. I just, it's just, you can deny absolute truth all you want, but even the relativist has got to live and communicate and think like truth is real, like absolute truth is real. So.
And that's the question is we apply like relativism to spirituality and reality, not to banking.
Yeah.
If you walk into the bank and you just deposited $10,000 from your financial aid, it was going to cover your year's tuition, and the bank teller said, gosh, according to my worldview and reality, you don't have any money. You didn't say, well, I'm a good relativist. Everybody's going to have a perspective. I'm not a pluralism and say, it's absurd.
That's because math is a human construction and it's not attached to the world in any manner, and so it's all up here and we all agree upon it.
So you're saying that God is not constructing reality, it disconnects from life and existence? What you've just done is modern dualism. You're Platonic, you're saying spiritual, physical, you never intersect, and you can't prove that.
I'm just saying that math is a completely self-contained and everybody agrees on it.
They do that?
Yeah.
I wouldn't.
Well, except for like Euclid's geometry and parallel lines.
Okay, except for those who believe it by faith because it's not provable beyond a shadow of a doubt.
Well, then those things start to contradict the sort of like dualism of like I can't be alive or I'm dead. Well, you can say, well, light can be like a wave or it can be a particle at the same time, and so that sort of like starts to poke holes in the idea that things are either true or false or alive or dead, like you were saying.
Well, okay then. I mean, are you working with the tension between a both and kind of logic and an either or kind of logic?
Well,
saying that reality is best reflected through an either or kind of thinking or a both and kind of thinking. Are you saying that we should only use a both and kind of thinking?
Well, he was checking me on the thing of whether things can be like true or false, and so I was like trying to say, well, there's evidence that true and false sort of thinking doesn't necessarily binary dualism doesn't work all the time.
Okay, then if that's the case, then my claim that it does work all the time is just as true as your claim that it doesn't work all the time. Because by the very definition of a both-and style of logic, you can believe both a both-and an either-or. Or you end up doing what the pluralist does and say, you must believe the both-and nothing else, or nothing else.
And hence the pluralist becomes an exclusivist.
Right. Exactly. And that's just been our whole...
Why can't the pluralist be inclusive? The pluralist doesn't have to say you must accept pluralism. It just says that there are other possibilities than exclusivism.
But if there are possibilities, then you eventually, to say that they're possible, now you've got to investigate whether or not they're actual.
But they're not trying to deny them, though.
But then you end up being an exclusivist because you say, well, it's possible. I'll investigate it. It's true or it's not true. You're back to exclusivism.
But why would you have to go investigate it and tell them? Why do you have to agree or disagree with them if you're a true pluralist? Like you were saying, if someone was a true pluralist, they wouldn't have a problem with exclusivism, right? Because if they believed that there were many forms, reality, and all religions, as you say, lead to God, they wouldn't be having a problem with exclusivists, right?
Mm-hmm.
But so it's the exclusivists having a problem with the pluralists saying that.
Now, the pluralists do have problems with exclusivism, but they're not consistent. If they were really consistent with their pluralism, they wouldn't have problems with anybody. See, when I call, I'll bring it into the realm of morality. When I call Jack the Ripper evil and say that his actions were morally wrong, that's perfectly consistent with my worldview. This guy, Robert Erickson, professor of history at Olympic College, published a book, Theologians Under Hitler, by Yale Press. He stated throughout that book that he's a moral relativist, yet he referred to Adolf Hitler as being morally evil, morally wrong was the words he used, over and over again. And so I explained to him, I said, I agree with you, Hitler was morally wrong, but you said in your book over and over again you're a moral relativist, therefore you can't call somebody morally wrong and be consistent with your worldview. And he looked at me and said, oh, I know, but I can live with that contradiction. And he smiled and walked away. If you can live with that contradiction, then why wouldn't they be able to live with anything that contradicted their worldview, i.e., the way exclusivism contradicts pluralism? So, once you say all views are equally true, it seems that the person loses what's that?
Does pluralism actually say they're equally true, or just that there's a possibility?
Or that you have equal right to... even that word's loaded there, but you could, if the pluralist is a relativist, that everybody's view is equally true, because there really is no such thing as absolute truth. But then the pluralist is at least a practical. Correct me if I'm wrong. The pluralist would be at least, and I'm talking the wider view of pluralism, which has been pretty much the focus of this discussion. The pluralist is pretty much a practical relativist, if not a philosophical relativist in the area of truth.
Relativism we're talking about, you don't need to judge, you can just suspend belief and maybe all the possibilities. It doesn't, it's like communism.